I moved around a lot growing up. My parents had divorced when I was really young, and I lived with my dad after that. We moved all the time, and the places we ended up living a lot of the time aren't what most would consider very nice places. It was hard for the old man to hold on to a steady job, so we moved from town to town. Sometimes we would find an okay place and stay for more than a while. Then he would get a call from Mom. They got into the biggest fights, and after her calls, like clockwork, we would pack up our things and get moving again. This is how it went until Toronto. It was a little slum on the outskirts of town. It's been so long I can't remember the name of the place. It was winter, and we didn't have heat in our place, or running water, or even electricity a lot of the time. But we made do. It was so cold, though, in that old brick building. That place was crazy, and not just because of what happened. The place was falling apart. But back in the 40s, it had been a fancy 5-star hotel. It was a huge 5-floor place. It was surrounded by a fence of barbed wire on all sides, but there were holes you could slip in through. This was in the early 90s, by the way. I doubt it's still there. I heard the whole area got gentrified. In the lobby there was this huge hole in the floor that led down into the basement. The other kids living in some of the other surrounding buildings would dare each other to make running jumps over it. The hotel, though, I should mention, was basically empty except for us and Grandma McDonald. Grandma McDonald was an older woman who lived down the hall. She was educated and had this old school charm to her, like a woman out of time. She was blind, but she could see things, you know. She said I could do the same, but I didn't really know what she meant. She never liked the idea of a kid living in the building. She came over one day while my dad was out. She asked me a lot of questions. Did I go to school? Did I like living in the hotel? Did I ever have any nightmares? That sort of thing. She gave me some old books she had. Then she told me something I'll never forget. She asked me to tell my dad to move out of the hotel. He didn't have to go far, just to one of the other buildings on the street. Really. When my dad got home, I told him what she had suggested, and believe me, he blew his lid. I'd never seen him that mad except when he and Mom were still married. He marched over to Grandma McDonald's room in the hotel and started yelling at her for trying to get rid of us, how it was selfish to want the whole hotel to herself, how she shouldn't be trying to raise his kid. She shouted back some stuff that at the time I didn't really understand. I mean, it all sounded crazy. She was yelling about how the guy who built this hotel, he'd been into some weird stuff, worshipping weird idols, kidnapping, and killing little kids, trying to open a door to his God's planet. The cops had raided the place back in the day to try and take him in, but before they could, he had slit his own throat with this crazy golden dagger. Dad called her crazy and told her that he could protect his kid without her help. He told me to keep away from her, to keep the door locked when he wasn't home, and that there was no telling what she could do, so to be careful. He threw out the books she had given me too, which sucked. At this point, I should probably mention the dreams. I thought at the time it was the cold, or the new sleeping location, but my dreams ever since we had moved there had been, well, the only thing you could call them was crazy. I would close my eyes, and when I opened them it was like I was in the mountains. The air was thin like up there. I was in the place. That's what I called it because I didn't really have another name for it. And whenever I woke up it was just so hard to describe. There was something kind of ineffable about it. I was so young I just didn't have the words yet to describe it. I still don't entirely have them now. It was just, for a while, where I went when I was dreaming. It was this cold and rocky endless plateau. It was like a maze of jagged rocks and canyons that weaved through the whole landscape. A blanket of fog covered everything. The sky above was visible through the gargantuan spider webs that hung above us, a night sky of stars that were not our own. I would walk for kilometers through this landscape. There was another reason these dreams were strange. See, usually when you have a dream, if it's the same dream over and over, you start at the start again. But here, any place I ended up at when I would wake up, I would end up exactly back there when I fell back asleep the next night. And more than that, when I woke up, my legs would be sore like I actually had been walking a great distance, and not just dreaming about it. This one night, I ended up on the edge of this indented clearing. I hid behind a rock and watched as this huge creature walked past. It was the first sign of another living thing I had seen. It was like a giant purple spider but with no head or body. It was all legs. It was the size of a car. Even though it didn't have eyes, I was scared it was going to see me, so I stayed hidden and didn't look at it. That was until I heard this horn blow. I had heard the sound before, but more distant. This one was very close. These little, I don't know, dwarves, they came up out from behind the rocks on the other side of the clearing and surrounded the thing. They were dressed in sort of robes and had big bandages wrapped over their heads and eyes, and they had these big golden spears. There were also these leather strips, kind of ceremonial looking. I was a small kid, and they were only slightly taller than me. The things terrified me. As they killed the creature, they spoke in these quick, sharp chatters and hyena laughs. It was like no language I had ever heard. And their mouths, oh man, their mouths. They had too many teeth. They brought the thing down, and as I watched, they started chopping it up with these tomahawks. They cut up the meat, and they ate it like wild dogs. They didn't even cook it or anything. I didn't want to look anymore. I ducked my head as fast as I could, and I hid behind the rock for a while. It wasn't long after that I noticed the laughter had stopped. I looked up. Their eyes were glowing yellow through their bandages. They were staring right at me. When I woke up, I was terrified. I dreaded falling back asleep all day. What was waiting for me on the other side? What were they going to do to me? I knew they were still there, able to plan while I was stuck here, a sitting duck. I remember that night we didn't have dinner, and I was so hungry, but I stayed awake under my blanket as long as I could that night, even as my eyelids got heavy and couldn't stay up. My eyes closed only for a second, but when I snapped up, I was awake in the place. They were all around me, but it wasn't what I thought. I think they thought I was one of them because of my height. They spoke to me in their language, and then with hand gestures. I didn't understand much, and they offered me some of the spider thing, but I refused. At that point, they got weird looks on the parts of their faces. I could see looks I didn't like. They were unclean, not physically. We were about the same on that front, but emotionally, bad vibes you would call it. From what I understood, the gnomes wanted to take me somewhere, to show me something, or someone. I didn't want to upset them any further, and agreed to go with them. They walked for a long time, for days it felt like, even though there was no sun here. They followed the stars. This dream had gone on longer than any of the other ones, and I started to wonder when, or if, I would ever wake up. Every time they offered me food, I would refuse, and in the dream I was getting more and more weak and emaciated. At one point, they took me down into the caves to a meetup of what I guess were some of the different tribes of their people. There were dozens of them, laughing and chattering. There was a big bonfire. They all danced around, and these big golden idols. There was 3 of them, like a trinity. One was this huge, ropey, angry-looking elephant. His eyes were shut, and just from looking at him, I got the feeling that something bad would happen if he opened them. The second, to the right, was this big scary-looking spider. It had too many legs like the other ones, but this one was different because it had a human skull for a face with more legs growing out of the eye holes. Looking at it, I got the feeling that maybe this was its place, that it had woven it like a web, and those other things were its children. These 2 were already the freakiest dream I had ever had. It wasn't how scary and big the statues were, but the implications, you know. Like if I looked at them too long, I felt like I might get sucked in. It was like a black hole. But the worst part was the smaller, center statue between the 2. That one was a man, a normal, average-looking man, except I couldn't see his face. Anytime I tried to look at it, it was like my eyes would drift away or lose focus. Something told me he was the worst of them, because I could meet him in real life, in the real world. Just before I woke up, I saw that there was another person there, another human like me, but on the other end of the chamber. He was strung up inside this kind of bamboo cage. He had been cut up really bad too. I couldn't see him clearly back then, but looking back now, I think it was my father. See, if I could see things like Grandma McDonald had said, I think my father could too. Maybe it's what attracted him to this place in the first place. See, around this time, he had started to get real sick. It was like a bad case of the flu, is what he said. When it got really bad, he locked himself in his own room and told me not to go in no matter what. Dad really cared about me, deep down, and he was trying to protect me from getting sick too. One night, after I had seen him in the bamboo cage, he woke up screaming. I could hear him in the walls, screaming in pain and crying. They're eating me. When he woke up, I listened through the door. I could hear him muttering, crying about how they were trying to hollow him out to put something else inside him, and that he wouldn't let them. My final night in the place came after that. The gnomes had taken me to the edge of the plateau, and beyond that was this sea of fog. In their language, they told me I had to go into the fog. I did. I wandered around, terrified and lost. The fog was so dense you couldn't see anything. Then, he was there. There was a man, tall and thin with slicked back hair and a tiny mustache. He was dressed in a suit and tie. It wasn't the modern style though, it was the style I had seen in the pictures on the wall of the hotel. His eyes had dark circles under them. He told me he had been lost in the fog for a very long time, and that he needed me to help him get out. He had gotten all turned around, and couldn't find the path back. I didn't trust him, but if he really was stuck here, it would be wrong not to help him. Maybe he was like me. If I kept coming to this place in my dreams, would I get lost too? As we walked, I asked him if he had come here in his dreams like me, and he told me he had been here so long he sometimes thought this was the real world, and where he had been before was the dream. I asked him if he had lived in the hotel too. He told me he had. He was a very rich man in his dreams, and had constructed the hotel based on his own blueprints. Once we got out of here, and back into his dream, he could pay me and my father a lot of money for our troubles. Something felt wrong about this even though I couldn't figure out what. I had forgotten something, and I didn't think I would be able to remember it unless I woke up. As we walked, I tried to wake myself up. Somehow, the man noticed. He grabbed me tight and twisted me around and asked me what I was doing. He was real angry and squeezed my shoulder so hard it bruised. He told me I was an ungrateful brat, just like all the others. I had seen more than most people ever dreamed of seeing, and should be thanking him. I realized his eyes were totally black. When he spoke, two voices came out. I don't know how I hadn't noticed before. He pinned me to the ground, and he told me that they wouldn't open the door unless there was a child. He gripped both my wrists in one hand, and the back of my neck in the other. He pushed my face hard into the ash we were walking in, and he told me if I wouldn't let him out on this end, he could make me on the other end. Then I woke up. I wasn't in my bed. I was strung over my father's shoulders, and he was carrying me down a flight of stairs. It was pitch dark, and we were in some area of the hotel I hadn't ever seen before. I asked him what was going on, and he didn't reply. Something was wrong. There was blood all over his hands. We left the stairwell and entered another room. A dim light shined down from the ceiling. I looked up. It was moonlight coming through a huge hole in the ceiling. We were in the basement of the hotel. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed around me the room had golden statues. They were the same statues from my dream, and in the center of the room was an altar. My hands and legs were tied, and Dad put me down on the altar. I finally saw his face. His eyes were black. He smiled down at me, but there was no kindness in it. It was a cruel smile. He opened some kind of secret door in the altar and pulled out a big gold knife, carved with writing all over it in something that looked like hieroglyphics, but definitely wasn't. He told me, speaking in many voices, including my dad's voice and the voice of the man in my dream, that he was the gateway, and that it was his destiny to be the prophet that would bring his religion to the world. As gods lived within him, within his body, he started chanting in something that sounded like no language I had ever heard. Just then, Grandma McDonald ran down the stairs. She stood there and her eyes glowed with white energy like stars. The man who wasn't my father cried out, "Get away, ghost. You have no dominion here." She raised her hand, and her palm glowed with white light. Just then, the man screamed as his eyes began to bleed. He scratched at his own face, ripping open chunks until his eyes turned from black to brown. And he was my father again. Dad looked at me and, hand shaking, raised the knife, slitting his own throat. The others inside of him screamed, and he fell to the ground. He was dead. Grandma McDonald got in contact with an aunt of mine after that whose name my dad had written down in his pocketbook. She lived down in Hawaii, but dropped everything when she heard about me, flew over, and was there to pick me up in about a day. I asked Grandma McDonald to come with us, but she told me she couldn't. She had to stay to watch over the place. I still live in Maui. Rent is expensive, but I've got a steady job and a girlfriend I'm thinking of proposing to. Every once in a while, maybe once every couple of years, I see or hear something strange, but nothing like the hotel. I spent years trying not to think back to that time in my life, Every time I did, all I could think about was that my dad was still in the place, trapped there. Was the hotel still standing? Or was it gone? Even if the hotel was gone, the place existed. It always would. And there were other places in our world like the hotel. And even if the building was torn down, was the ground itself and the air tainted? I had a dream about my dad recently. It was back in the place. He told me that I shouldn't worry about him, that I should be happy, and that he was proud of me for who I had grown up to be. I guess I'm writing all this because I finally just want to get it all out there and be done with it. I'm gonna try to be happy now. Love you, Dad.